welcome to the webinar From Screening to Intervention, How Schools Develop Comprehensive Behavior Supports for Students Using the BIMAS-2 Assessment. Dr. Achilles Bardos is the co-author of the BIMAS-2. He is a graduate of the Ohio State University and is professor in the Department of School Psychology at the University of Northern Colorado. Dr. Bardos' teaching and research interests include educational and psychological assessment, program evaluation, and computer applications in psychology. He has published many articles and book chapters and presented over 200 papers and workshops at national and international conferences. Dr. Jim McDougal is the co-author of the BIMAS-2. He is an associate professor and director of the school psychology program at the State University of New York at Oswego. And he teaches courses in assessment and interventions for academics and behavior and consultation, and supervises field-based practicum and internship experiences. He's the formal mental health coordinator for Syracuse City School District, where he integrated mental health services in the schools and provided mental health, behavioral, and academic consultation services to over 40 schools and programs. Dr. McDougal has 20 years of experience as a practicing school psychologist and has considerable experience consulting students with academic and behavior problems and conducting staff development for educators. Andrea Amador, to no fault of her own, is not able to be here today. We do apologize. Luckily, Dr. Bardos and Dr. McDougal will speak about her work at Boston Public Schools, as they have presented and worked with her numerous times in the past. And there is Dr. McDougal's best attempt to be Dr. Amador. So go ahead, gentlemen, you can take it away. Welcome.
There we go. That's our title, From Screening to Intervention, How Schools Use Comprehensive Behavioral Supports. So I am Jim McDougal. The idea here is that we've been looking at mental health, children's mental health, as a considerable issue in the schools. It's one of the most prevalent, prominent, and important issues for decades now. First paper I ever wrote was with Kevin Quinn in the University of Albany. And in 1998, we reviewed over 30 years of research in Tier 1 journals, finding widespread, persistent, prevalent difficulties in two major behavioral health areas, one being internalizing and one being externalizing. Schools and researchers, educators, clinicians had known about this for decades in 1998, which was decades ago, and had been unwilling, or just ineffective in applying practices that were effective with these populations. At the same time we were kind of eyeing the problem, we were also finding that it's very difficult to alter positive change in the schools without altering the school environment. So we take, as school psychologists, and I am a school psychologist, take students one-on-one into our offices and try and implement change. And oftentimes that doesn't generalize into the other settings that are important for the child's life, like the classroom, the home, and so forth. And so positive psychology is a movement that was actually started by the APA president, right, Sullivan, and is a movement to get environments to help foster resiliency, positive change, and to prevent a vaccination or inoculation from mental health difficulties. And then my conclusion after a couple decades working in the schools is similar to RTI, response to intervention, which required curriculum-based measurement to provide screening, brief, repeatable, and valid, reliable ways for screening and progress monitoring. We needed the same thing for behavioral health. Over the last few decades, we've adopted a public health approach. So we're emphasizing prevention, early intervention, and changing the course of these trajectories, and trajectories of many behavioral health problems, also many public health problems. And schools have adopted many more effective practices around, ISF, or Interconnected Systems Framework, PBIS, RTI. And now it looks like there's real traction around MTSS, which is the logical extension to RTI. RTI seemed to focus on the academic realm. And now we're looking at social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health, how you kind of articulate it. So schools have settled problematic areas with prevention like practices. It's not new to schools. So all children that enter school are screened for vision, hearing, and speech and language. And those difficulties have been largely corrected for. We provide services for kids in these areas. We screen them very early on because we know that they're going to have difficulties if they have these problems. And the treatment that we provide is effective. Speech and language is the most effective special ed services in terms of declassing kids after a series of intense interventions for the difficulty. We also screen kids for reading now, because we've identified reading is a significant difficulty for many kids. 1 in 5 kids have some kind of reading delay, and dyslexia is now becoming a very prominent area of concern, which has always been there. Just we finally turned our attention to it. So schools are working on this. I don't think they're there yet. I don't think every school and across the nation provides early universal screening for reading delays and monitors students' progress and provides appropriate interventions when they're required. But I think we're getting better. Now, the last area, the final frontier, if you will, for accommodating and improving children's outcomes is around children's mental health, social emotional development, behavioral health, SEL, whatever you want to call it. The reason we're doing screening and the reason we're implementing these programs is because 1 in 5 kids suffer from a mental disorder sometime in their school career. And they suffer terribly. And so do the individuals that work with them, their families, their school teachers, and so forth. We know that internalizing and externalizing are the most prevalent, developmentally targeted problems in these areas. And we know suicide is the second to third leading cause of death for adolescents. And these rates have increased considerably, right? So schools have, for whatever reason, not adopted universal screening for behavioral health. But the fact that there's hundreds of folks on this webinar is very encouraging in terms of where we are as an educational community or clinical community. And we know if we can focus on concern areas for populations like classrooms, grade levels, or schools, and provide tier 1 programming to change the environment to accommodate students and to increase their ability to cope, to problem solve, to cooperate, and so forth, that we can provide a buffer for this. For kids that have elevated risk before they reach the point of disorder, we can provide targeted services to decrease that risk and decrease the number of kids that will end up with some kind of mental health disorder. And we need data in order to do that, in order to tell us what's working, what's not working, what kids versus what kids are fine, and to help make our services more efficient. So anyway, youth risk. So this is the youth risk behavior surveillance system, or what's called the youth risk behavior. Is CDC's been doing this since around 1990, and they typically every 2 years they survey thousands of kids across the country, and they analyze the results, and they've been doing the same questions across that period of time. So we use this as a way to understand what concerns kids are engaged in or concerning behaviors. So the risk survey from 2019, which is the most recent one, has identified, obviously high levels of externalizing problems around carrying guns and threatening and physical fights and bullying and didn't go to school because kids felt unsafe. So those things still exist. It's also uncovered increasingly a very concerning level of internalizing like behaviors. In the last survey, and the numbers on the right are the changes from 2017 to 2019. So they would be seen as a result of the pandemic, perhaps. 37% of kids reported feeling persistent feelings of hopelessness, meaning they felt every day that they hopeless feelings every day for 2 or more weeks at a time, continuous time within the last 12 months. 19% considered suicide, 16% developed a plan, 9% attempted suicide. 9% of kids attempted suicide within the last 12 months, and 3.5% attempted to the extent they had to go to the ER or hospital. This isn't new. It's not like suicidal behavior has hugely increased or these thoughts. It's just that our focus on it has changed. In 91, the first youth risk survey, 7.3% of kids said that they attempted suicide in the last 12 months. Well, that's increased some, but it's always been pretty flat between 7 and 8 or 9%, right? It's the second, third leading cause of death for adolescents. I served on a crisis counseling and district level crisis counseling response team for 10 years, and I coordinated and ran it and responded to dozens of suicides, which was definitely the most difficult part of my job. So This hugely affects school communities. When we have a suicide, we interrupt instruction for days and days. We increase the suicidal risk for all students in that community and in surrounding communities and in a family. It's a traumatic event that we should do everything we can to prevent, not respond to, right? We're also seeing an overwhelming impact on the pandemic. The pandemic has had on children's mental health. Emergency rooms have seen a huge increase in kids referred for services for mental health problems. In Clark County, Las Vegas, which is a very large school district, they went back to in-person learning after 18 children committed suicide. One of our local pediatricians noted a 50% increase in referrals for mental health problems and felt he was spending most of his time dealing with mental health problems, not health problems. There's a very good series that was done by a local reporter here in Syracuse, Megan Coleman, which is available at this link and also at her website I'll show you. Megan interviewed kids and people and practitioners to look at the effect of the COVID on mental health, children's mental health. And I also did a little literature review, and within one evening, I found dozens of articles at an international level that looked at the effects of COVID-19 on mental health, children's mental health, and so forth. So the implications here are that, there we go. Implications here are that a lot of kids are internalizing at a high school level. There's also a lot of kids that are externalizing that we've always dealt with because they make the office more often and become behavioral problems. But if you consider the level that was identified in the Youth Risk Survey, 9% of kids attempt suicide in a high school, 1,000 students, that's 90 kids that attempted within the last 12 months. If 19% seriously thought about it, that's 190 kids per 1,000. That's a lot of kids. And those numbers mirror what we find when we do self-assessments at a high school or secondary level with the BIMAS, when we ask kids about their thoughts of self-harm, about their levels of anxiety, depression, and so forth. Those mirror the results that we get. So I think we need to do more about that. I think we need to be more proactive. We now know what to do. Universal screening is the key. So if we want to alter the course of serious and significant mental health, behavioral health concerns, we need to ask kids and teachers around externalizing, internalizing, and also cognitive attention problems. So it's time we do something different. And I know schools don't like that very much, neither do I. But instead of reacting to crisis, the way that we may actually be more effective is respond to intervention. So the important piece to that is universal screening and an emphasis on services that are effective. By far, the most effective services I've seen and that literature has supported are those that are delivered in school, a tier 1 service. And most effective, I mean, they impact the greatest number of kids. And they also have some of the highest effect levels when we look at data from different program evaluations of schools across the country. So mental health interventions are integrated in the regular curriculum. Those are the ones that were most effective. As effective or more effective than one-on-one counseling. If you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, tier 1's the way to do it. The progression of these orders is identifiable, predictable. We know we can intervene. If we intervene early, we'll be the most effective, and younger students are just more likely to respond. So it's been depressing to me that for decades, only 3 to 5% of districts across the country did any kind of universal screening for children's mental health or children's behavioral health. This is increasing. So now I see estimates of 12 to 15%. I'm optimistic that they'll be changed in the future. We still have a long ways to go. So typical barriers I hear about all the time are, if we identify kids, we're going to open Pandora's box. We're going to have this big flood of kids and we're going to have to do something about it. We won't have adequate resources, which I think is nonsense. Our data has suggested that you're largely aware of the kids. You just haven't mobilized a systemic response to them. And where we have seen huge increases in referrals is around suicide or suicidal ideation. And that's a good thing because mental health teams are set up to respond to kids, to intervene when they have suicidal thoughts. The alternative is to respond once they complete the act. And that's not a viable alternative. So they also figure they'll be liable, which we have not found any district to be liable for mental health screening results because they've taken the time to actually do this work. I don't think there's a court in the nation that's going to, allow a lawsuit against them. I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't check with your lawyer. I don't think it increases your liability. I think it increases your liability if you don't. through universal screening. So these assessments, they went too fast. Universal screening for MTSS is just like screening for other problems that affect children, vision, reading, behavior, and so forth. It requires the same kind of things that academic universal screening does. It should be brief, repeatable, sensitive to change over time, research-based, and valid and reliable for its intended purpose. If you want a valid and reliable measure for assessing risk concern in internalizing external cognitive behavioral problems, then you need to choose a measure that's been norms and standardized for that. All right. So very quickly, what we mean by this is if I have norms, I should have norms from a population of students that mirror what I have in my district. So I worked in a very urban district with lots of diversity and socioeconomic challenge and so forth. And so I want to make sure that whatever measure I use had those kids included. I want populations of kids from across the country, different ethnicity, different grade level, different genders, different and so forth. You get the idea. I also want to make sure that the assessment is reliable, meaning it's accurate. So it's internal, the items all track one composite. If they're on that composite, they have internal consistency. It's if I test and retest within a short amount of time, it should provide me similar results, or the measure has too much error. And different raters should have some convergence on scores, or it's going to be confusing what to do with the data. It should also be meaningful, meaning the constructs of interest pertain to research-based principles. And it should, in screening, accurately predict whether kids are typical, so that I don't spend intervention services on kids that don't need it, while also identifying with high levels of accuracy those kids that do need our services, so we can capitalize on our work. For progress monitoring is a little different. Progress monitoring tools should be sensitive to change. So diagnostic tests are not useful for progress monitoring because they're not really set up to change. They're set up to categorize kids in different diagnostic categories. It should reflect progress when intervention is present, but not when it's not present. It should be easy to administer, short, and it should be useful for a variety of groups so we can track changes across time and across populations. What brought us to kind of understanding progress monitoring is our other co-author, Scott Meyer, who has 30 years of research experience in this area. What he was finding was, based on the research, different scales will show, based on the same kids in treatment, different scales will show different change levels. And that there was growing evidence to suggest that if you wanted to demonstrate a change that's kids made in therapy or in some psychosocial treatment, we had to choose measures that were likely to demonstrate that change. So he found that the choice of the measure made as much impact on the assessed change as the choice of intervention. So it's a meaningful consideration. And there's Scott Meyer, we call him the Edison of change-sensitive items, because just like Edison tried different filaments, thousands of different filaments to find ones that gave the most light without heat, he tried thousands of different item sets to identify items that were sensitive to intervention effect or change over time versus those that just changed over time regardless of intervention. And so we kind of created our BIMAS in a novel way, which is we took sets of items that Scott found to be change sensitive so they could monitor change over time, and we made a screener with them, where other folks I see are making screeners out of diagnostic measures. And we know from our work that those diagnostic items are not generally sensitive to change. And so Meyer's done a series of recent work where he's shown that therapies that are informed with change-sensitive items and that get data over time each week, perhaps from like a teacher, a parent, and or the clinician, are much more effective than those that don't have that formative assessment data, because clinicians can alter their treatment much more quickly to respond to whether or not it's working, right? So, and that's pretty much what this says too, that is shown that indicates that we're more effective when we do that work. So MTSS, does your measures, important considerations, does your measures assess strengths and risk? Assessing, for instance, diet and exercise without assessing for a white 55-year-old male, without also assessing my cholesterol, my blood pressure, and I don't know, my liver functioning, is only half the battle. So we need to assess both. Can your measure inform intervention design? Does it tell you about populations and their levels of risk for different problems? Can you use it for screening and progress monitoring? Is it sensitive to change, and can it identify folks with problems when in fact they have problems, and the inverse? And is it technically adequate? I am seeing, I get asked all the time, what do I think about this SEL assessment or this system or whatever? And increasingly, I'm seeing those that are very flashy and computerized without any psychometric data indicating whether they're reliable or valid. So I would have no idea whether those are psychometrically sound, or whether I would, I know that I wouldn't advise anybody to use them if they didn't know whether they were accurate or meaningful. Largely be a waste of time. So when selecting an MTSS measure, again, normed, reliable, valid. So for progress monitoring, I always ask folks, is it sensitive to change, and how do you know? Very few of them have been designed for this. And so that we typically don't get past that first hurdle. And then if it is it easy to administer? Is it useful for a variety of groups, or is it narrow band, like it only assesses anxiety or assesses, I don't know, for instance, suicide? There's also an exciting website that I didn't want to take too long to share, but I'll take 2 seconds. I just set this up this week, and it's been based on about 20 years of our work. So my piece of the BIMAS and all of this is I am a school-based person, and I help schools implement the data to inform their MTSS teams. What I wanted to show you here is just to read the level of resources we have. I collected, I don't know how many, hundreds of articles and presentations and so forth, but there is resources and presentations on how to support children's behavioral health, identify internalizing and treat it, implementing MTSS and so forth. And then down here, there's dozens and dozens of articles on universal screening, on MTSS, on program evaluations and so forth. And so the link is in the PowerPoint right there, and I'll be more than happy to have you visit the site if you want to be on a blog or receive a newsletter.
We met with a Boston group and we public schools, and actually began our collaboration about 10 years ago. At that point, they were looking into their practices. And from my discussions with Andrea, with Dr. Mary Cohen, Jill Snyder, the entire team there, the major concern that they have was the fact that you couldn't have enough school psychologists handle the number of referrals that they were getting in Boston public schools. So they stopped and said, we need to do business slightly differently. Maybe we should have a more preventative model and build the capacity within the Boston public schools to provide instruction, intervention support, and so forth, and have this follow the model of an RTI type, with a universal, targeted, and incentive intensive services. Of course, at that point, they were considering also a tool, a data-driven approach to guide their decisions. And they tried, they piloted a number of instruments. They piloted the BIMAS and a number of others. And we were glad that they saw that some of what Jim has been referring to in his talk so far were in alignment with our goals and mission and their purpose in changing the practices. So along with a couple of the university folks there in the area in Boston, like Melissa Perro and some of the others, they built a new logic model of how the school should operate as far as mental health services were concerned. So they started with 10 schools at the beginning during the 2012-13 school year. They kind of dealt with challenges, hurdles, and so forth. And at this point, they have about 50 of their schools that are actually implementing the model. They use the practice model, the NASP's practice model, to guide some of their decisions in terms of practices, in terms of tools, in terms of interventions, and so forth. And of course, I'm not going to represent all of the good work they have done, but they actually, the heart of all of this was the creation of a model. This particular model had to be simple for people to understand, people to follow. So of course, in Boston, they came up with a lighthouse. And here you see the universal screening, you see the interventions, all blended, integrated, and so forth. You see some of the interventions at the tier 2 level and at the tier 3 level, and you see all of the supports that they have gathered around their practices. Now, some big cities have the supports, but even smaller cities will have that kind of a support. For example, the police department, the judicial system. These are all the family and services, children and family services. These things exist throughout the entire country at a greater maybe magnitude in some than others, but they all exist. So they said, we're gonna, whatever decisions we make, we're gonna make them with data. And that's where they were utilizing the BIMAS along with their academic and other data they had to drive their decisions. And that's what they were telling us. They were telling us that using the Castle framework as their foundation and using PBIS, the two combined were actually the foundations of all of their practices. And in their little pyramid, they had three basic foundation blocks: instruction, assessment, and database decision making. And this is what they were saying: what we're doing, what we're going to do, why are we doing it, how are we going to do it. And with this kind of a discussion, they have trained all of their individuals, school psychologists, social workers, school principals, and so forth, to start thinking in terms of these three dimensions. And of course, as I said, they chose the BIMAS for this particular practice. Now, of course, you will say, so what? Well, the so what came over the years as they've been presenting in professional conferences, showing the impact of their work, the impact of the comprehensive health model in terms of the outcomes. So using, for example, this data to estimate effect sizes, they have determined that over the years, they've seen a difference in terms of conduct, effect size of 0.80. A significant difference in terms of the negative effect, depression, anxieties, and so forth. The cognitive attention, the same thing. Most, and here is the social, 0.80. Here is the academic, 0.80. So it makes a difference. Comprehensive mental health services do pay off. That's the message from our colleagues from Boston public schools. So I think if you need to receive some more information about some of their work, they have made all of these things available to the general public. If you visit their website, they have a website with all the resources, implementation at the tier 1 level, implementation at the tier 2 level, steps, handouts, letters to parents, you name it. Both of these individuals are kind of the heart, in addition to a number of others, I don't have space to put them in here, who have contributed to this awesome work on mental health within a public school system. And but that's all I'm gonna talk about as far as the work with by the Boston Public School. Now I wanna turn a little bit to some other topics that relate mostly to SEL. I think Jim made a very good point and argument about all of the statistics that we have about the traditional way of looking at student behavior through the internalizing, externalizing, which were actually the foundation of some of our early work. So let's talk about universal targeted and interventions at this level. And let's discuss this concept that is receiving lots of attention these days, the social emotional learning, I guess, trend, I would say. I do make some distinction between some of the terms because everybody uses SEL. And I said, no, it's not really SEL. Actually, it is social emotional skills first. These are the competencies that we all have. We develop them from the moment we're born. We develop them every day from early childhood to, I don't care how old you are, you still build on these competencies. And these are the competencies that allow us to be successful in life to a great extent. The ability to exercise empathy, to manage our emotions, to connect with others, talking about relationships, talking about conscientiousness, mindfulness. And of course, how do you put all of these things, all of these concepts together? Well, how you put them is you create a framework, and there are a gazillion of frameworks out there. The one that really survived and been the most prominent one has been the Castle framework. Now, we talked about social emotional skills. So what is social emotional learning? Well, social emotional learning is the process that we all go through to learn those social emotional skills. And that process could be your formal teaching. You have a class or you have a curriculum where you teach people about empathy. You talk about responsible decision making. You talk about relationships and so forth. Now, sometimes these skills, of course, within the social emotional learning effort, might be sufficient enough for us to overcome life challenges. And some of the times this might not be enough. And how do we see that they're not enough? Well, we see them because they're exhibiting themselves through our behaviors. And sometimes they might be extreme or maybe not acceptable by society and so forth. And we might start describing them as psychological symptoms. And these are the symptoms again of anxiety, depression, and so forth that Jim talked about earlier that lead us to have individuals, we will describe individuals in need of some mental health support in public schools within the MTSS framework. So the question here is, the Castle framework in many respects, as you will see, is promoting kind of a public health approach to mental health. And in our attempt now to look at the social emotional skills, social emotional learnings, and having data to drive some of these decisions, and you're choosing a screening to accomplish all of this, you may want to ask the legitimate question. So what exactly do you want your screening to accomplish? And I think a simple answer is to assess the skills and assess the behaviors so that we can link the two together. And that's exactly what the Castle framework actually, from our perspective, is doing, is actually connects the skills that we build and we have and we develop with desired outcomes. And the desired outcomes, once you build the short-term outcomes in here, relate to the behavioral outcomes that you see over here. So the primary purpose of any kind of a screening, follow up a little bit from Jim, is to evaluate all individuals within a certain group on certain targeted constructs of interest. So, for example, we will ask, what kind of a social emotional skills do they possess? Are there emotions, feelings that lead to problematic behaviors? What levels of support might be needed there? How would intervention efforts be evaluated once you have a program in place? And a very, very important question is, how actionable are the data of your SEL tool? You will see a lot of people these days coming up with a variety of tools because this is really a hot area. And you will see guides, you will see statements, you will see people making claims, all making references to the Castle framework. But a legitimate question is, when you put all of these things in place, do you really have hardcore data to drive those decisions? Or do you just have rhetorics and feeling good statements about SEL as they're connecting to the Castle framework? One of the questions, for example, when we talk about actionable data is how soon you will see the impact of an SEL intervention or initiative in your district. And the question is, you will see it the answer is, you will see it in about maybe 3 to 4 years. And this is not a statistic that I came up with. This is what the literature is saying. Of course, what do you do in those 3 years from the moment that you are actually implementing this SEL curriculum? What happens to those kids in the tier 2 and tier 3? For first time, I think 2 days ago, for first time, a report came out of the Castle organization, and it said SEL and back to school mental health issues. And I'm going to read you directly from their writing. It says, SEL will be an important part of supporting students' well-being. New research suggests many young people, likely 30 to 40%, have experienced negative impacts on their mental health or social and emotional well-being during the pandemic. This is the key statement I would like you to pay attention to. While SEL does not replace needed mental health services, SEL can promote mental wellness in many ways. So it is the first time that I think, maybe it was written somewhere else, but it's the first time that I've read it where the SEL folks are saying to us, you know, it is a good thing for us to be, and I think we're going to make the difference. And I believe they will make the difference with the protective factors that will buffer life challenges. But they're also saying, you know, there is more to mental health than just SEL. Now, of course, the question, if you're a school district, you will say, well, which one do I pick? Which battle do I fight? Or can I actually do both? Can I actually introduce both SEL and also identify the kids with actionable data who are calling for mental health supports? And in your effort, as my colleague said earlier, ask the question about how they were developed. Is there a rationale and a theory, or do they simply utilize this trendy language and the rhetoric of the castle? Do they offer evidence for what claims they make as they relate to SEL long-term desired outcomes? You saw the Boston School, the Boston Public School, in the most recent publication they had in the professional literature. They looked into the data across a period of about 7 years, and they said it does work. And here is the data why comprehensive mental health services works. And they had an instrument that will allow them to reliably and validly make that kind of a statement. So let's not confuse sometimes people saying we are a strength-based assessment and so forth, and here is the highlight of our practices. Well, it's not really. SEL instruction should be strength-based. Let's not confuse it only with assessment. That might have a good appeal, but is really the hardcore of the whole assessment business. So if you hear those kinds of claims, ask for the validity evidence. I'm telling you, none is presented. And most of the statements are really faith-based instead of research-based. Now, let's not forget again the 1 in 5 kids that Jim just mentioned earlier. So back in the Castle framework, connecting skills with outcomes. What they're saying here for us is that there are going to be lots of SEL approaches, curricula, culture in the school, climate, and so forth. Our goal will be to go into the second short-term outcome column and see how can we determine the SEL skills, not with perceptions and attitudes, but with actual demonstrated, self-reported or demonstrated behaviors. So we'll take care of the short-term business in this. And then in the long run, what the Castle says is that we should be looking for long-term outcomes such as behavioral and academic outcomes, desirable behavior and academic outcomes. Well, how do you measure? What exactly do they propose for us to measure as desired outcomes? Positive social behavior, fewer conduct problems, less emotional distress, and improve academic performance. Ultimately, this is why we do the business of social emotional learning, or all of this, the social emotional learning. I'll stick with that term for now. Now let's look at how we, with the work of the BIMAS, measure some of this. Well, with the short-term outcomes, you will be able to measure not only the needs, but also the skills, the SELs, the social emotional skills that the kids have. Long-term, you will be using the standard view of the BIMAS to look into social skills, conduct, negative, academic. I mean, we worked very independently from the Castle framework, but when you look at even the names of the labels of their scales, they are pretty much in direct alignment. So you won't see this particular column anymore on the Castle framework. I couldn't find it anymore. What you see now is you see a different presentation, which is the same thing. Simply, they put them in different places. So SEL skills are essential, are important, and we should be teaching them just like any of the academic skills. Curricula, there are going to be hundreds of players out there. There are already hundreds of players, all of them, some remote, some paper and pencil, some hybrid, and so forth. I would argue, and I would suggest, when you are making those kinds of choices about the SEL curriculum, go back to the Castle framework, go back to the resources and see. They have a very good guide that says what makes an evidence-based intervention. and you'll find out yourselves how many really of the curricula that have been proposed out there meet those kinds of standards. You will be very disappointed as to that the claims do not really match some of the standards that the CASEL is proposing. In terms of assessment, judge the screening tools with the same rigor as you judge any other tool: standardization, reliability, validity, and all of this. Reliability, everybody can get reliability with 5 or 6 items measuring something. Look carefully into what kind of quality of decisions, what kind of actionable data do you end up when you are administering a screening instrument. So look beyond rhetorics. Look beyond fancy dashboards, because that's now technology allow us to take any kind of piece of information and make it look good. But we should go beyond that. Don't measure just attitudes and perceptions. This might be good for long-term perhaps outcomes, but for actionable data, you really need behaviors. Be critical and demand evidence. That's kind of my pep talk in terms of the SEL, and ask also for technical manuals. You will, we are all, most of you were psychologists and with master's degrees. We were all familiar with technical manuals. You will see very few out there with technical manuals, but lots of claims about research evidence and so forth. So what is the BIMAS? I'll go into that. Well, with the BIMAS, we will be using it as, and I'll show you how it's been used as a universal screening and progress monitoring tool across tier 1, and also as a progress monitoring tool in tiers 2 and tier 3 of interventions. And I say progress monitoring at a tier 1 because data for this particular circle will go over and over and over, and then you will have the ability to do so. So with the CASEL framework and the BIMAS, you will have 2 versions and 2 views of the kids' behavior. You will be able to see it from an SEL perspective, from a CASEL perspective, and you will be able to see it from the standard perspective that Jim was discussing earlier. So it's a web-based, multi-informant, parent, teacher, self. The self form is in 2 languages, English and Spanish, and 9, not 6 languages. That's my mistake. 9 more languages are coming up in about 2 weeks within the platform. So the kids really will be able to respond to their own native language. Clinicians from outside of your public schools will also be able to participate, and you can monitor the interventions that they are delivering to us. It is designed for kids from preschool all the way to 18, and now we have data all the way up to 35, but are not really publicly available yet. Administration time, 2 minutes per student for the teachers and the parents. The parent form is written in the 4th grade readability level. So already Jim talked about the content validity, the work of my colleague, Dr. Scott Meyer, and we just didn't throw in the scale just any particular item. We were very careful in selecting the items that demonstrated the behaviors that an intervention should be able to be, a tool should be able to, detect that effect of that intervention. Nationally normed with reliability evidence, with the validity evidence. Important validity evidence here is the screening accuracy. Here is the sample, 5,000 kids across the 3 different informants with over 1,000 something clinical samples to demonstrate the accuracy of the screening efficiency. When we're looking into the forms, look at the reliabilities, or for a screening instrument are in exceptional levels. Clinical samples, I already mentioned, 1,355 kids. Look at the instruments that have been out there in the market. Some of them have 1 study with 45 children, and they're claiming they're really having classification accuracy statistics. I don't know. So here is the classification accuracy statistics: 82%, 78, and 72% overall correct classification. For a screening instrument of 2 minutes administration, that is really powerful statistics. So here is the dual view of the BIMAS. When we're going to go into the platform, you will see that you are able at any point to go from a standard view to a comprehensive view for the instrument. The standard view will have all of these scales, just like Jim described, and the comprehensive, of course, will have the scales that relate to the CASEL framework. All right, so I'm gonna skip this. And of course, some of you might ask, how did you come up with all of these scales? How did you align? We did not align them alone. We actually collaborated with our colleagues in Boston, who after they have implemented the BIMAS and their second step curriculum and some of the other SEL programs in PBIS, we came closer and they said to us, we really need to align these observable behaviors to these frameworks. So we spent about a year going back and forth with data to really align the BIMAS data with the CASTLE framework. And we came up and used, for example, the second step as a guide. What do you teach on second step? What are the skills that we're trying to develop? What are the competencies that are reflected into the SEL? What are the BIMAS items? So we went through that for a number of the items over here. So problem solving here, emotional management, empathy, and so forth. So all of this information was the one that drove us in the development of this, what we call dual perspective, and we claim to be the most comprehensive assessment of student behavior at the screening level for social emotional skills and behavior. So from the BIMAS standard, you're going to get this, and you're going to get a classroom picture. From an SEL perspective, you're going to get this with a social awareness, self-management, and of course, a different classroom perspective. So that's pretty much what the BIMAS is in kind of an MTSS action for 1, 2, and 3 tiers of MTSS support. So what I'm going to do next is I'm gonna stop sharing this screen and try to go to the platform. Let's see how successful I'm going to be on that one. All right, let's see now. I was able to log in, and can you tell me if you're seeing the BIMAS interface?
Yes, we are.
Okay, oh, good. So I went through the traditional login with a password and a login email, and here is what we call a staging platform, kind of a show and tell. So everything that you see over here are all fake names of individuals, buildings, and so forth. So I'll give you a little overview of the simplicity and also complexity. Simplicity in terms of operation, complexity in terms of or the data that you are getting out of the platform. For example, the first thing you do on the platform is you build its database. The database includes the schools, includes the staff that they work there with their various roles, teachers, school psychologists, related personnel, administrators. All of these individuals have different access level to students, buildings, at the district level. And of course, you have the students. I'm going to click on the students just so I can show you the number of variables you can actually enter. First name, last name, grade. This is a new feature we added when some of you went into hybrid instruction and you wanted to group kids in different subgroupings, and administrative stuff in terms of the Title I, IDEA, MTSS, ESL, ELL, absences, office referrals. If you would like to include those, you include them. If you don't like to include them, you don't have to. So that's kind of the students. Now let's pretend that we have the data set up and we set up a universal screening window. That's kind of another part of the presentation about how you do all of these things. And we have in the Learning Center of the BIMAS little videos that describe all of this. But for now, let's pay attention to the universal assessment and what are the things that you can do. Well, you can look, for example, as to how many universal assessment periods you have as part of your SEL initiative. You can create a new one if you're ready to start this kind of a fall of 2021. While you're setting up all of this and you invite individuals to perform the universal screening, you have a number of things that you can accomplish. For example, you can monitor, you can do the progress monitoring of the universal screening process. You can see who are the buildings who are completing, who are the teachers who are completing, who are the students who are completing, who are the parents who are completing, if you are inviting them all. Jim will probably be talking a little bit later on about this critical item report. Once you have all of this data in place and the data are done and completed, all of these things, by the way, they are dynamic. The moment one student or one teacher has submitted one record, you can do all of these things in here and you can keep looking at it over and over and over and over. So Dr. McDougal, what would you like me to do here? Are you there?
Can you hear me, Achilles?
Yes, I can.
I'm sorry about your sound issues. So I've been trying to resolve that. So the first thing school teams usually do is look at a large report of either district level or school level. So select one with some data.
I'll select all the teachers. How about if I select all the grades and I'll select all the schools?
That's a fine idea.
Okay. I click view report.
Yeah.
And now I have a district level report.
Right. And so what that shows us is the percentage and number of kids with varying degrees of risk for the 3 behavioral concern scales and skills that aren't quite up to par on the adaptive scales. And so we'd select or target whatever one of these is the focus of our intervention, or whichever we're most concerned, perhaps the conduct scale or set of items, because it looks like 23% of kids have some elevated level of risk in that area. And so that might be the focus of your PBIS initiative in the fall. Achilles will show you how to drill down to identify both the kids that are contributing to that risk and also the particular behaviors or items that most attributed to that to inform your intervention.
Okay, and as you can see here, I have all the schools and all the grades. So what I can do lots of filtering in here if I want to organize the data across the district in a different way. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this Sunnyside Elementary, and I'm going to pick up only all the grades from this particular building. Automatically, I have a different picture of my data for only the Sunnyside Elementary. Now, I'm still into this BIMAS standard, Jim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig into the classrooms. I can select specific. I'm going to put all the classrooms and all the kids from all of the classrooms, but I can filter it out as well. So now all of the kids at Sunnyside Elementary are listed here with their name and their standard scores. And the MTSS level that they are, you already have them as a district at the beginning, although all of this will be 1. And you have the ability also to sort them and find out who are the kids who might need more support in certain areas. For example, here we have some at-risk kids, and then we have one here named Greg that is really at a very, very high risk. Scrolling down the statistics, you have all of the data for the entire building, or again, as I said, filter them by grade level, and you have this data that are repeating themselves just like in the triangles above. So now, curiously, before we do any system intervention stuff, Jim, how about if we look into Greg? Because Greg is really a kiddo that has been calling for attention all over the place.
What Achilles is showing is what a fine job he did with the programmers, in creating a capability to drill down from a district level to a school level, to a grade level, to a class level, and then to the individual. And at the individual level, to drill down right to the specific items at each point in time that contributed to the rating that the child received. And he's going to show you.
Yep, and before that, here is another piece of progress monitoring where you see, for example, the universal assessment data for this particular student, and you see the history of this student in our district. We have data from winter, spring, and summer. We have data from the student themselves. And if we scroll down, you will see some other data. Here is an SEL perspective of the exact same behaviors, and also an SEL perspective from the student's point of view. The teacher here thinks that we're having some serious issues. The student thinks here where everything is rosy and perfectly fine. So now to dig even farther and deeper into the data, I can click on any of these blue labels up on the top on the period, and I'm going to, before we go into that, Jim, how about if we look into the conduct area, because we see here, we go.
That's a fine idea, Achilles.
green, green, yellow, green, green, red. So I'm gonna click on the conduct and I see the data now where we have the raw scores, we have the T-scores, we have the confidence intervals, percentiles, we have a classification of the performance, and this classification is not based on Jim and I's perspective, but based on national norm data. And then we have the reliable change index that tells us if really this change from this behavior to behavior is also not only just category wise, but statistically they are also significant. So you can do this for all of these different aspects of the 5 scales, whether that again, it is the standard or the SEL. But let's go deeper into the summary. Yes.
Just to say that what you just illustrated is a school team looking at that kid and that kid's data over time. That kid was fine right up until recently. And so what that illustrates is the ability to intervene in October, as opposed to when the kid's getting thrown out of school in February, March, and April. And so the early identification provides a critical window for schools providing treatment, and also to say, hey, this kid's going downhill in a hurry, so what's up?
Yep, and that's what I was referring to earlier when I said actionable data with the screening and the data that you have in your hands. But now, Jim, I entered the Greg's individual rating data. So here is conduct, and here is his negative effect. I mean, he is really, and I pick up this one because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, lots of reds in here, high risk. Here it says some risk, and on the negative effect, it says high risk. What are we saying here?
So a couple things. One is at the top of that report is the legend that's used. So from 0 to 4, meaning from never to very often, these are the behavioral levels or the number of times the teacher observed these behaviors in the last week. And last week is because we want it to be sensitive to that time period and sensitive to change. Also, if you want to know the items in each of the scales, they're right there in front of you. And the teacher's actual rating is right there from 0 to 4 with the item level standardized, item level scores from whatever those are worth. But you can see this kid's got a lot of concerns. And also, as Achilles has covered in item 24, we have that critical item around thoughts of self-harm, which is at a 4, meaning very often this kid's had thoughts of self-harm. So okay. This is what needs immediate assistance.
Yeah. So Jim, when the student was taking this exam, if this was a self-report and endorsed number 4 or 3 or 2, automatically the platform takes you over here to where it says critical item reports. And on the critical item reports, as a psychologist, you will be able, so this was a demo from yesterday, but let me show you here. I'm going to select a period like the one from this, and I will select the student only. This is a dynamic report. You can keep this open during your screening, and you will find out that maybe I'll do my 10th graders today. These 10th graders here, automatically, the moment they endorse this particular item, they become a part of this little unique table. At any time the screening is taking place, I can actually sort out by the magnitude of item 24, and I can find out, for example, that Lynn DeMarco here has a T-score of 71 in the negative effect and is endorsing I have very frequent thoughts of hurting myself with the 2 standard deviations above the mean on the negative effect. Now, this is a kiddo that I will not let go away from the building without me talking to them. This kiddo, this kiddo, this kiddo, and maybe the rest of them might be good candidates for maybe kind of a small group intervention that relates to self-harm behaviors and so forth. So I look consistently both at the overall score, which is the most reliable in here, and also on the actual endorsement. There was an article last year that was published by one psychologist here in Colorado, where she actually did the screening and identified about 6 kids on the verge of actually taking their life. And the article is titled, "It's Okay Not to Be Okay." And it shows her efforts to implement comprehensive behavioral health services that address trauma, that address all of these things that are really the purpose of why we do screening at the school different level.
What the rationale for creating this list was that assessment, because they went from using teacher ratings for children's internalizing and suicidal behavior, where they identified 20 kids in a high school of over 1,000. When they did the self-assessments, they identified over 200 kids, and they were much more accurate in terms of reporting their internal feelings and also their suicidal ideation, which is a thought that's not observable, so that makes sense. But it's also really changed the way we think about identification of these problematic behaviors at a secondary level. Since they're inside, you need to ask students.
Okay. So let's go back to Greg, our student. We decided as a team that we're going to be implementing some kind of an intervention, either for him or for a small group of kids. All we have to do is just go to where it says progress monitoring, and we can click create progress monitoring plan. And here you can name this one Greg or whatever the case might be. And you can assign a case manager. You can assign the intervention and teacher. You can assign some clinical notes to describe what this intervention is all about. And you can build your intervention plan here. You can do a pre-test, post-test design. So here is your first assessment piece, the BIMAS standard. How often? Once. You're going to do the pre-test. When you're going to start, when you're going to finish, and so forth. Then you're going to add another monitoring plan. What is that new monitoring plan? Do you still want to continue on with something else? No, I want to actually pick up another kind of a monitoring item, monitoring behavior for Greg. Maybe Greg is also experiencing some serious aggression issues. So I have created an aggression plan, progress monitoring plan for another kiddo, or I can, because that's why it's available here in the menu, or I can go and build a brand new one for just Greg. So I can select the aggression plan for Greg and say when it's going to start. Well, I want this to be daily, not just one. I want this to be a daily report from whoever is the teacher who we decide to do. So here is the name of the student, Greg, and here are, there he is. And here are now the people. Who are the people do you want to introduce? Well, maybe I'll pick up some random names in here of teachers. As you can see, you have an unlimited number of people that you can add into the process. Let's say I'm going to put Dr. Anna Freud. She works at Sunnyside Elementary, and all of these individuals. I can include the parent here. I can include the child if they're above 12 years old, and I can build this particular plan. I can click save it, and it will be the monitoring plan. The BIMAS platform takes over and notifies all of these individuals about when a behavior is due, when a rating is due, and monitors the entire progress. Now, of course, you want to see what it looks like, and I have only, I believe, 1 minute, and I'm done because I'm running out of time. And I'm just going to show you here one plan that I have for a very troublesome adolescent named Achilles Bardos. And here he is. Here is his plan. His plan involved a pre-test that was done once, a weekly monitoring of my bullying kind of related behaviors. You can name whatever you want to name this intervention, this monitoring plans. A weekly thing about my depression, and then a post-test on the very, very bottom here. At the same time, because this is from August to December, I want a monthly standard form to be administered monthly. So here is the data. So when you enter it as a psychologist, you are able to see all of this beauty with all of the data being collected, who has been reporting the data, who is completing. Here is, for example, Ms. Jenny Kovac, who did not finish the item on the bullying. And the bullying was a very flex item. This concept of flex, we developed it about the early 2001, and we're very honored that some people actually are using it today in their work, the flex monitoring plan. But ours is a little bit different. It's a little bit more powerful. Not only allows you to have the items as they were identified or developed during the process, but we can have also custom items in our flex option. So here as a rater, for example, for this teacher, you can say this happened this, and I can put some comments. This happened this often, and I can put some comments about the behavior and so forth. And I'm going to provide this information and provide this information in here. I'm going to click submit, and now this becomes part of the record. Now, let's pretend now that you want to view what is going on with all of these little check marks. All you have to do, just click on the student's name. You open the student's name and you scroll down. Here is all of my screening data. And then scrolling down, here is my monitoring plans. Let's look at the results. I click on the results, and here is all the ratings for the different behaviors. Well, if numbers and colors, well, I'm not gonna show that to a parent or to a team. I will probably go and copy this particular graph, and I can introduce that in my report as part of the MTSS process. And if I scroll down, all of them have the same option. Not only that, but as you can see, I have different raters. I can compare, I can have the data from the various raters for the standard form. And then I can have also comparisons between the different raters on the various scales, conduct, negative effect, and so forth. But because we've been pounding this and doing all of the demonstrations with, with a standard form, I don't want you to lose the message that all of these things that we just described right here are also actually available right here too. If you select, of course, the particular school like Sunnyside, and I hear somebody's gonna tell me now that I had too much time.
She's gonna cut you off, Achilles. What I wanted to emphasize is during your flex assessment talk is that we developed those so that clinicians could put treatment goals, schools could put IEP goals, some tier 2 supports could put goals of specific, like banana splits programs or whatever. And that would be formative data you could collect from different sources like the home, the teacher, the clinician, or whomever to contextualize your standardized data.
And okay, thank you, Jim. And this is now the SEL perspective, like just said, here is the report. If you want to go into the classroom, you get the total SEL score and all of the other scales. Here, you're also able to do the sorting. You can pick up Greg again over here or any of the kiddos, and you can go down and you can see now his SEL data that we were just showing you earlier on. And you can follow the same principle. Now, all of the items are going to be, let's open this one. And all of the items now, here is now self-awareness and all the items that the team kind of assigned to the self-awareness, to the self-management, and to the social awareness and so forth. So I think I'm gonna stop here and go into, let me see, how do I stop this?
You're gonna pull up the PowerPoint and then share your screen again. But in the meantime, I just wanna thank you both. We're not finished yet.
Okay.
I just want to thank you both for presenting. We are going to get to the heart of some of the questions that were asked as soon as I'm finished going through that PowerPoint. And I'm going to give you both an opportunity to say a little bit more. So if Achilles, once you get the PowerPoint up, on this webinar has the opportunity to get 10% off all WPS products, excluding the ADOS2, with that discount code on the website. However, if you'd like to have more information or get a quote about for the BIMAS-2, you can email consult@wpspublish.com. We will put that in the chat box, and you can use your 10% off for that as well. If you have any additional questions after this webinar is over, you can contact your assessment consultant at consult@wpspublish.com, and they can answer any of the questions that you still have after the webinar. The next slide is a map of the territories for your assessment consultants, just so you can see who is the consultant for your state. And the next slide is also, I would encourage you to go to wpspublish.com/webinars to see any upcoming webinars we have. We also have some very valuable resources online. We have our WPS online evaluation system. We have our video resources. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you would see a lot of resources there. And we also have a content hub on our website. The next slide has a contact us page. If you would like to contact us, you can also fill this out and you will be able to contact us through those means as well. So the question and answer, here we go. We get to the question and answer phase, and I'm probably going to come to one or the other of you, but if I don't call your name and you feel that you want to answer the question, please feel free to jump in. But Jim, first I'd like to start with you and ask you, if I'm an administrator, oh, by the way, this is rapid fire time. We have 15 minutes to get through everything. So if you could keep your answers to about 30 seconds or less, 45 seconds, that would be great. So rapid fire, here we go. I'm an administrator and you are talking about the BIMAS-2 in an elevator to me. You know how short time frame that is. Tell me why, as an administrator, I would want to use the BIMAS-2.
Financial. If you intervene early and save one kid from alternative placement, you've saved 10 times what the alternative placement is going to cost. Social, because you're going to change outcomes for kids. And in terms of staff, it's going to allow us to be much more effective and efficient instead of chasing our tails around in circles and seeing one kid after another after he blew up in a classroom. Out.
Great. All right. All right. So do these screenings and possible follow-up using the BIMAS, do you need parent permission for this?
Got that too. Perry Zirkle, I actually asked him that same question because my research, and my cousin's a lawyer, so we looked into this for a whole day. No, you don't. You need passive consent and opt-out. You need to inform parents of your programming assessment. You need to allow them to opt out if they wish, and you have to share show them the instrument if they request it.
Okay. What impact are you seeing that from social media that is having on mental health?
That's Achilles, because you just included social media.
Say that question again. I was expecting Jim to answer it.
So what impact are you seeing on mental health from social media?
Well, no matter where you turn these days, the statistics are kind of gruesome, scary statistics about the percentage of kids coming back with trauma, with negative experiences due to the pandemic. But pandemic aside, we already knew we had our own pandemic in mental health for the 20%, 1 in 5 kids. So that one on top of what we experienced the last 2 years, I think social media is pounding the message, do something about it. So
yeah, children's mental health has been coined a silent epidemic. And with social media and the pandemic, it is now a not silent epidemic.
So another reason to get some universal screening tools and some progress monitoring tools for these issues. How are socioeconomic factors such as economic background, education, race, et cetera, accounted for in the development of the questions used in the BIMAS-2?
Well, we did the traditional, bias analysis that you have in the development of any single instrument with content experts, psychologists, colleagues, where we looked at the content of this, and that's that was the very, very first step we followed. Now, are there going to be differences? Of course, there are differences from one group to another. But the fact that we have the national norm data is the first filter of protecting against any equity issues and so forth. And the BIMAS platform allows you to study some of these equity issues. Now, you have to exercise also your professional judgment based on the number of kids or the type of kids that you're working in the setting, community, and so forth when you're looking at these numbers. The instrument by itself will not actually be filtering out all of these challenges in the interpretation of the data. Simply, the instrument has taken care of itself by not allowing you to have bad messages. But are the bad messages there? Probably so, but you have to exercise that yourself as a user. Now I can hear you.
I saw that you have clinical groups in there. So one of the questions, I'm going to mix 2 questions together if you can address both parts. So I did see ADHD, et cetera. So did you consider students with special needs, ADD, ADHD, it says anxiety, stress disorders, et cetera, and also deaf, hard of hearing, or visual impairment?
I think we had about 8, 9 or such categories when we did this. Our goal there was to represent as much as possible the entire population of a typical public school where any of these kiddos could be a candidate or a person attending the school. That's why we did not pay attention to just one or another. We looked at the kids with autism, we looked at kids with emotional behavioral issues and so forth. And the question was, can the BIMAS be sensitive enough to identify this particular the kiddo who might belong to that particular group? And we were very pleasantly surprised that it did work with many of these clinical groups. So we didn't just pick up one EBD group and said, oh, here is behavioral disorders externalizing and it works. No, we looked at many of them. Jim, go ahead.
So two other things. One, if the screener doesn't include clinical groups in their standardization, then they don't know the extent to which it's sensitive to identifying students with known problems. So that would be a problem. Secondly, one of the questions was specific to a kind of a low incident or specialized group of students with maybe some kind of visual or hearing impairment or some kind of low incidence disability. And we may not have included them, we may not know, but we'd be very happy to help users look at the data that they've received to look at the extent to which it's different. We've been doing this for 20 years and we've not found that there's many subgroup huge differences. If that makes sense.
Okay. And is French one of the 9 languages for the BIMAS too?
Yeah, yes, it is.
Okay.
It's a Romance language.
Oui.
Is there a professional licensing or certification needed to do the assessments through the BIMAS-2?
No. If you have a master's degree with some training in an assessment, and if you're part of an SEL team where one or two of the members or one of the members is familiar with psychometrics, with the proper use of an instrument, then you will be just perfectly fine.
Okay. If I give it to a single child, will it help me diagnose a child and offer recommendations for intervention that I can use in my report?
This one. Diagnose, no. This is not a diagnostic instrument. If you're going to diagnose a kid, you do need parental consent, and that's a very important distinction. This is a screener that identifies behaviors that link to composites that are prevalent areas of difficulties for kids at certain developmental levels. So it is not a diagnostic instrument, and that's very important. Just like having a student do 1 minute of oral reading fluency is not a diagnostic instrument. Will it tell you some areas of concern that you should investigate? Absolutely. So thanks.
Are there validity scales?
No, we did not.
So there's two. It is valid and has been studied to be valid in terms of classifying students with problems when they have problems and so forth. There's validity studies that we did. Does it have validity scales? Like if I hit these 2 items at this level, does it tell me that I'm negativistic or that I'm unreliable or whatever? No, it doesn't. And the ones that are out there, quite honestly, have been found in some research not to be necessarily all that accurate. So it's a screener. So over 34 items, you're not going to trick people in terms of identifying same behaviors at different levels like you could with a 150 item scale.
Well, and you also have, it's not just a self-report. So you also have other informants that are giving information. So you can compare those to each other as well. Yeah. So
it's all pieces of the puzzle. Nothing's, there's no assessment. That's the whole everything.
Right. And so are there modules?
And Stephanie went on this one as a follow-up. If there is a concern while the SEL team is actually evaluating the data, and one teachers might say, well, this doesn't seem to be right in terms of somebody else's rating of the behavior, you have the option to invite the individual to provide their own evaluation as part of, and it remains part of the student behavioral record in the BIMAS.
Okay. Are there modules to teach the skills identified as weaknesses or specific interventions suggested?
Go ahead, Jim.
So we've been intervention neutral, sort of kind of like Holland. We see interventions come and go. We see interventions that are more effective in some places than others, that are more embraced in some places than others. And so this is strictly a data screening and monitoring tool. We have lists of interventions that have been empirically supported that are available on a spreadsheet and the websites that promote them, but we are not an intervention. We are the data.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we have combined, we have a resource on the page where you look into every single scale and items, and right next to it, we found what Jim said, resources out there available to the general public that you can look as well. But definitely we're not intervention specific.
Right. Okay. So you have a self-report part of it. You have a teacher report. Is there also a parent report, or just the self-report and teacher report?
There is a parent report also. Yeah.
There's a teacher, parent, child, and clinician.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rating forms. Yeah.
All right. And then one question, I just want some clarification, just so that people in the audience of the webinar can get a better understanding. So I watched you talk about the screening, and I hear you, Jim, multiple times say, this is a screening measure, this is a screening measure. So once you use it as the screening measure and you've identified those who come out in that at risk or that area that you want to monitor further, you can then do progress monitoring as you go along. Do you use the same measure to do that, or do you then go into the individual plan and create the individual plan, or can you do both?
Yeah, both. I think Achilles covered that, but
I just want clarification.
Yeah. So for my in the ideal world, I would give a standard version and universal assessment. I would select kids with different levels of concern that I want to intervene with, and I would set up a monitoring plan that included weekly flex assessments based on their area of concern or the outcomes I desire in my group, and then get weekly information to inform my intervention over time. And then when I think I've made a change, do the standardized version again to assess the level of change, and also whether or not things are going in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay.
More summative measure.
So so when you're saying the flex version, I remember the days where teachers would be asked to walk around with clipboards and write things down and things like that. How does the practical piece of it work? Are they given something at the end of the week? How does that work?
Everything's computerized because Achilles took care of that. And the system, if you tell it to email a teacher on Friday afternoon, they get an email, there's an assessment pending, they click on it, go in there, do their rating, 3 items, boom, 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 hit submit, and you're done. Yep. And then all that information is achievable.
Once you set up the progress monitoring plan, the BIMAS platform takes over. So around midnight, I believe, of the day that is due, it sends emails to the people who are part of the monitoring team. And when they open their email in the morning, they get an invitation that says, Stephanie's behavior monitoring plan is due for rating today. And then all they have to do is just click on the little button that takes them to the form, and they complete the form. So,
well, I will tell you.
So Stephanie, a common question we get to jump into your questions is, what kind of training do I need for teachers to complete the assessment? And we say very little, because the system sends them a link to their assessments. They hit on it, and from there, anybody that can retrieve a Groupon can fill out the BIMAS assessments and hit submit. Right?
Yeah,
okay.
and for those who want to be trained for the universal assessment, how do I really implement this in my public school? And I want to train my teachers to the concept. Well, the concept of SEL, you have to sell it yourself. We're not going to help you with that one. I think as much as we, we will, but if we can. But the idea is, how do I learn this new tool? It's a 7-minute video that we have for a teacher to go through and find out, this is how you log in, this is what you're going to see, this is what you press, and this is how you take the data and you generate a report. If you would like to have a report, this is what you need to take if you go to an SEL team for conversations about your students' behavior. And
okay.
then the toolbox I was referring earlier from Boston Public Schools has a gazillion of forms. How do you run an SEL team that reviews student behavioral data? So there are many of them out there, but we kind of like that because we have seen it being operational and successful for over the years. So
right. So that website, a new website that I shared, is the supplement to the BIMAS, which is, I've got the data, now what? Different guides, professional development, and forums to guide school teams in using the data, which we think is, from our perspective, the most important part.
All right. Well, we are at the time where we are supposed to come to a close. So I do want to just offer some final remarks. First, I want to thank Dr. Bardos and Dr. McDougal for coming here today and presenting on the BIMAS-2. I know it's a lot of information to share in a short period of time. I also want to say, as a former practitioner, well, I am a school psychologist. I worked in schools for 19 years. I wish I had had a tool like this, because with the ease that you say, if I was an administrator and I can set up a system that automatically emails people to fill it out, and I have this quick look at my school at a glance, at the grade level at a glance, this was information that we were struggling to collect. So I'll just say, this is a phenomenal tool. I'm so glad you came and talked about it today. If any of you want more information about this and you still have questions that we didn't get to, please email consult@wpspublish.com. It will be in the chat box. And we hope to see you on some of our future webinars. So again, thank you for attending today. You will get a link sent to you so that you can get a recording of this webinar and you can share it with your administrators. In addition, we will be working on the sound of that recording to try to improve the beginning sound, so it's easier for you to listen to. But again, we appreciate your attendance at WPS. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Dr. McDougal and Dr. Bardos.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.